Question time today. But for now, I want to go to this issue of Iran. We saw those Saudi Arabian oil facilities bombed on the weekend. The finger of blame is being pointed, without any public proof yet, at Iran, of course. And this comes out at the same time that Australia has committed naval resources to help guarantee the safety of oil tanker passages through the Straits of Hormuz, particularly from Iranian interference, and while, of course, 3 Australians languish in Iranian jails. I caught up earlier today with Behnam Ben Taleblu, who's an expert on Iran. He's actually a senior fellow with the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies in the US. I spoke with him earlier today. Behnam, thanks for joining us. Tell us firstly about these attacks on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. It's been denied from Tehran that they are the work of Iran, but everything points in their direction, doesn't it?
Well, great to be with you. Most unfortunately, everything does point in Tehran's direction. The Islamic Republic of Iran exports both cruise missiles and drones. These are the 2 weapons currently being floated right now in the American press as to the most likely delivery vehicles for the attack on the 2 major Saudi oil facilities. The Houthis, which are a significant partner of Iran, they're in Yemen. They've taken credit for it, but the U.S. has hinted at the attack coming from either Iraq or Iran. And there's different ramifications based on which piece of geography you think the attack came from.
The Houthis claiming credit for this, claiming a responsibility for this from Yemen, as you say. I mean, they're backed by Iran anyway, so either way, the handiwork of Iran is at play.
Most unfortunately, yes, whether it's the Iraqi Shia militias, which have received Iranian ballistic missiles, or if it's the Houthis in Yemen, which have received both cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. Either way, Iran is fanning the flames of this conflict. And if you can broaden the aperture a little bit, it is Iran doing what it's done in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, which is impede the free flow of oil, but exporting that policy onto land now.
This gets to, of course, the Great Schism in that part of the world that I don't think we focus on enough in the broader public debate in this country and in Western liberal democracies, and that, of course, is the Shia-Sunni divide. That's what's driving this, and, of course, Iran being the powerhouse of the Shia world is absolutely determined to make sure it can get some sort of supremacy over the Sunnis and Saudi Arabia in particular.
Well, that's right, and that's one factor, although I wouldn't say it's the primary factor. I think both sides have an incentive to make their rhetoric more sectarian and thus grow the invective against the other. One can castigate the other side as failing to stand up for Muslim hearts and minds. And, you know, they both rush to be champions of Muslim Palestine, and they both have this kind of cultural cachet that they want to draw upon to be champions of the Islamic world. However, the reason I said it's not the primary factor is because strategy matters a bit more here. Saudi Arabia is going to be on the Persian Gulf the champion of the pro-Western status quo order, and Iran is going to be the champion of the anti-Western, anti-status quo order. And this is as much about the Middle East regional balance and who gets the resources in this area and who gets to control this area as to what kind of ideas exist in this area.
Well, first up, what sort of retaliation can we expect to these attacks on the Saudi facilities? Surely this is not going to go without a response from either Middle Eastern or even perhaps Western countries like the US and UK.
I think Washington's response to these strikes is going to be a little bit harder to gauge here. You're seeing already oil prices spike. You're seeing already a little bit of a diminished supply because of Saudi Aramco having to put out less in response to this. So Washington may want to help Saudi Arabia make up some of this spare market capacity. But in terms of battlefield responses, if the Saudis feel comfortable taking the Houthis' claim of the attack at face value, then Saudi Arabia may step up bombing in Yemen, particularly North Yemen, which is the stronghold of the Houthis. However, if it's proven that it came from Iraq or even Iran, then ultimately it's a fundamentally different calculation. Would they strike Iran-backed Shia militias in Iraq? Would they strike the men? Would they strike the bases? Would they strike, munitions depots? What would they actually strike? And once you get into Iraq, it's going to become more complicated.
Now, when we talk about what Iran is doing in the region and the response of the rest of the world to that, of course, you've got to look at the United States. And the United States has been much more hardline, especially under Donald Trump, of course, against Iran than other Western liberal democracies. To what extent do you see the resignation or sacking of John Bolton as Donald Trump's security advisor as being linked to Iran policy, and how do you think that we could see Donald Trump's stance towards Iran change in coming weeks and months?
You know, despite coming from Washington, I tend not to engage in the Kremlinology that is Washington, who's up, who's down, based on the constellation of forces in the White House. I think you've had a fairly consistent policy despite changes in personnel from the Trump administration, and that policy is maximum pressure towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. The ultimate aim of this maximum pressure campaign is to get Iran back to the negotiating table, not just to focus on the nuclear issue, but to get the conditions in place for a bigger, broader, better deal that addresses some of these regional issues that we're now having to deal with. Now, ultimately, part of Iran's escalation and its escalation of its proxies is designed to spook Washington so that it stops the sanctions strategy. We know that President Trump in the States has said he looks forward to hopefully trying to meet Iranian leaders in the near future, perhaps even on the sidelines of the UNGA. What the Iranians are trying to incentivize is that kind of sort of premature diplomacy, which has nothing to do with the American personnel in power, but has everything to do with Iran trying to turn up the heat and force the U.S. to swerve first.
OK, front of mind for Australians, of course, is both the deployment of Australian naval vessels, naval personnel, to the coalition forces to try and guarantee oil supplies through the Straits of Hormuz. That plays us directly into the power plays that are ongoing there. But of course, we learn now that at least 3 Australians are in custody in Iran. What are their prospects? We don't know a lot about charges against them. We don't know a lot about the processes, judicial processes, but we do assume that these geostrategic issues are going to be played out as to how Iran handles their incarceration or release.
That's right, and most unfortunately, this is the Islamic Republic of Iran doing what it does best, international hostage-taking. Traditionally, it's gone after foreign nationals that are dual nationals that are at least one part Iranian. Now they've absolutely broadened the aperture, going after Australians of different sorts, including British Australians. This is, again, a desire by the regime in Tehran to spook Australia, as well as liberal democracies around the world, that actually may care about what's going on in the region. And to the first part of your question, Australia is part of this coalition called Operation Sentinel, designed to ensure the free flow of oil in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. This is not just a hat tip to the U.S. max pressure campaign. This is, in my assessment, something fundamental in Australia's national interests. And regardless of the hostage situation, which we hope is resolved, but unfortunately was out of the press for quite some time, thus giving the Iranians more leverage over the Australians, regardless of this dynamic, the Islamic Republic of Iran needs to be contested in places like the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz by countries like Australia, which have an economic interest in ensuring the free flow of oil, as well as a normative interest. Because as has been reported extensively in the Australian media, Australia has issues with freedom of navigation with a state to the north, and that's China. So hopefully one norm defended in one area can translate well to a norm defended in another area.
Indeed. Now, Behnam, your response there regarding these prisoners or hostages, as you described them, are you saying that now that this is out in the public arena, now that there's a lot of media coverage around these issues, it makes the situation much more difficult?
I think the publicity is a tool that could be wielded by the likes of DFAT or the Australian government, because, again, it's in Iran's incentive to keep this private, to have the Australian government try to offer something in return. You know, the Islamic Republic of Iran, when it engages in hostage-taking at the low level, you know, of dual nationals, usually when this comes to light, it's because of press reporting or some kind of leak. And that that changes that dynamic, and that puts pressure on the government of Iran to have to justify a reason or to have to justify a response. So now would be the time to demarche the Iranian government. Now would be the time to denounce the way the Iranian judiciary has acted. Now would be the time to turn Iran's narrative on its own head, to use publicity as a vector of pressure against the regime to take these people and be able to release these hostages.
Yeah, maximum pressure on Iran now from Australia is your advice. We'll take that on board. Just finally then, Behnam, I'm just interested in your medium to long-term outlook on Iran. We've seen the changes that the country's gone through since the revolution. We've seen a lot of focus previously on the uprising of Iranian people against the theocracy, if you like. Is there any hope in the medium to long term that we will see a more liberal Iran, that the people there, a more liberal democracy rising in that country?
Well, right now, if you just look at the constellation of players in Iran, it's the state on one side and society on the other side. But unfortunately, the state has all the tools of coercion and repression and aggression that it can use against this post-revolutionary society. You know, it's a revolutionary state that governs or oversees this post-revolutionary society. Ultimately, in my view, the good guys are winning, but it is a much more long-term assessment. I think the more Iranians realize that reform is not possible, that revolution, therefore, will be inevitable. So much matters now on the conditions, on the structural changes, on the supreme leader's health, on the resolve of the international community to stand with the Iranian people the next time they're on the streets. So there's a lot more factors at play here. But in the long term, if we look in the past to justify the future, the past 100 years of Iranian history have been filled with protests from the society against the state, and that's not likely to end anytime soon.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.